Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. Our broken economy, growth that has stalled for all except most affluent Americans, was recently the subject we took up with former Senate counsel Ganesh Sitaraman, author of The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. Today we examine an unhinged American culture, self-perpetuating inequality, with Alissa Quart, editor of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which publishes writers from rural areas across the United States in collaboration with local newsrooms. Quart is also the author of a column, Outclassed, for The Guardian, that examines a precarious workforce teetering on the brink of poverty. Middle class used to denote comfort and security. Not anymore, Quart writes, of a new, unstable American economic condition. In partnership with local freelancers and publications, Quart and her colleagues are embarking on a new series of reporting projects that chronicle the plight of American workers, from lawyers and small business owners, to farmers and miners, to nail artists and barbers, from the Rust Belt to the prairies to the inner cities of America. Welcome, Alissa.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, Alexander.
And congratulations on this work, which is inspiring.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, we've been doing this since 2012. Barbara Ehrenreich founded it, and I took over, and we've been finding writers, a third of our writers are low income, to write about their own experiences.
Rather than outsourcing writers from the coasts, you embed in the experience people who are from these communities, natives.
Exactly. So the idea of the series, which is on the ground, we're doing with The Guardian, is to go to places that Ohio, Montana, Kansas, and get local writers to write about, report on their communities. They know things that we don't know. They know that Oklahoma has a 4-day school week because they can't afford 5 days of school for their school kids. I didn't know that. And they then report on it, runs in The Guardian, and hopefully will also run in a local publication. So the idea is to grow journalistic ecosystems in places that have been left behind.
And you note in an interview with the Nieman Foundation that your goal is to transcend a red-blue, left-right dichotomy through which we seem to understand. And you and your co-founder point out that the largest swath of Trump voters was affluent. It was not the miner or the nail salon worker. That's an enormous challenge, to take prejudice and transcend it through your reporting. How are you finding that today you're able to do that or not yet able to do that?
Well, I mean, there's different things. Like we have low income or economically struggling writers in blue states who are overcoming their own prejudice. They're overcoming the ways that the lower income person is demonized, when they're reporting on being underbanked, as a recent journalist did. But, when we're trying to get writers in places like Kansas and Ohio, it's easy for them to report. For us, the tricky part is how to place it locally, whether local papers want to get reporting of this kind on their pages. So that's been our challenge.
And do they?
It's been up and down. Some of them have been incredibly receptive, and some of the papers have been less so, yeah.
As a function of economics, as a function of what?
Who knows? I mean, some of it's probably, they didn't generate the stories. Maybe, the writers did, we did, and that's not usually the way that traditional local newsrooms worked. But potentially it's also, they they still think that we're importing writers, even though we're getting local writers. But for the most part, it's worked out wonderfully, and we're getting these people in places that are, at this point, 73% of the journalism is on the coast, on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and that leaves, 27% for the rest of this country. And so our hope now with Economic Hardship Reporting Project is to try to place get writers, coming up in places that are now news deserts.
How do you define economic hardship?
That's interesting because, one of the things is that more than 3 out of 4 Americans are sometimes living from paycheck to paycheck. So that's one stat. Another is middle class life is 30% more expensive than it was 20 years ago. And that also means that the middle class is suffering and working class people are suffering. The upper middle class may have it a little easier, as Richard Reeves recently pointed out, but they also have their own gap between the extremely wealthy. So what you're seeing is wage stagnation, you're seeing a top 1% that averages 40 times more income than the bottom 90%. And that, to me, it's not only about poverty, it's about economic instability and kind of a troubled financial state.
The New York Times reported on this, our broken economy, and showed how there's been disproportionately astronomical growth in the 99.999 percentile. Whereas since 1980, growth and mobility have sunk.
Exactly.
For everybody else. So when you report in these communities so far, do you testify to the inequality? How is the inequality being explained to employees who are working 3 jobs and not cutting it?
Well, sometimes it's not being explained. Like one of the pieces I wrote was on teachers who have to moonlight as Uber drivers. So these are unionized teachers in, this is in blue states, in places like, outside San Francisco, et cetera. And then here they are on their weekends, after school, grading papers at stop signs and stoplights. And I don't think the fact that their wages are not keeping up with, say, the costs of rent or real estate in these places is being explained at all. They're just allowed to sort of flounder. And that was a story that was sort of shocking to me.
In these communities, when we see the stock market gains actually have an inverse relationship with wage growth, in other words, as the wealthy get wealthier, the middle class, or what was the middle class, lose out. There wasn't an acknowledgement in this presidency so far. There hasn't been an acknowledgement that that is the relationship between stock market gains and Main Street. Is there that realization now on the ground, or to what extent have you felt that from your reporters and editing some of these pieces?
We're not seeing it as much as we'd like. We ran a piece by a Montana reporter who was talking to sustenance hunters and also ranchers, and some of these people were Trump supporters initially, who now saw that national lands were being appropriated and they were going to lose their ability to hunt or to ranch, and they were having their livelihoods challenged. And that was a realization for that population, and that was a really interesting story. But by and large, I think people have they're oriented towards status. So they see, some of these voters in some of these places see Donald Trump and his minions as having status, and they kind of want that status for themselves, and they don't really make the connection necessarily between their own difficulties economically and his particular mantra.
How are folks able to overcome the hardship? You see communities that are deprived of wealth in this country, an opioid epidemic that has stung suburban and even some rural Americans. What are the responses to this hardship? How are folks attempting to cope?
So in my reporting, I found a lot of really bespoke solutions, which were small bore solutions. To me, the big solutions have to be things like universal pre-K that's worked really well in New York City. It has to be, a more sustainable daycare system so people are not paying 30 to 50% of their wages on daycare, more affordable housing, et cetera. But in lieu of that, we have people I've interviewed who are kind of cobbling together solutions. They are parenting collectively when they're not romantic partners because they can't afford rent or daycare unless they band together. They're creating things like co-ops, cooperatives, if they're domestic workers. There's one called Co-opify that just started in Sunset Park where domestic workers are organizing, and that's how they're able to sustain themselves. I think some corporations have taken the lead. There's something like 200 corporations that have now have nurseries on site because they understand their workers are struggling with daycare and the lack of maternity leave. And so a company like Zutano did that. So these are smaller solutions. And I think more deeply, people have to have conversations that are really open about their economic struggles. And that's the one thing that we can do for ourselves. If our government is failing us, we can start to have conversations among ourselves with our children and with our friends and with our colleagues about our obstacles economically.
An example might be a collective of Uber drivers. I had the same experience recently where I met a behavioral scientist, a behavioral counselor of some 2 decades. During the day, he's in that job. In the evening, he's driving an Uber. There's been a movement towards more grassroots unionization in the labor force. How is that evolving so far in response to what has been the enactment or the promise of more deregulation from the executive branch?
So you're talking about the gig economy, the rise of the gig economy. And I mean, one thing that's really interesting I just wrote about was there's a nonprofit that's been trying to organize Lyft and Uber drivers, and they're all on their Bluetooths while they're on riding, and they're trying to organize against automation. And I thought that was really fascinating. So they'll have 20 people on a conference call doing that, and that seems like automation of driverless cars and trucks, and that seemed like a kind of fresh and unusual way to bring workers together. There are the things like the cooperatives that I was discussing before. And I think then there's also just an awareness that so many of us are moonlighting. Something like multiple job holders or moonlighters in 2016 were completely on the rise. And I think we just need to know that that's happening and, kind of protect ourselves a little.
What states and localities have made measures to improve the situation?
Well, one of the things that I'm not exactly sure what's going on right now with the gig economy. I mean, one of the issues I've personally been following has been just-in-time labor, which was, people working at odd hours for companies like Abercrombie and Home Depot, where people were working for at 10:30 at night when they had kids at home till 2:30 or at midnight because they were trying to please the corporate behemoth. And there's been a lot of local legislation around the country trying to rein in those kind of hours. So that's been, to me, an improvement in terms of labor practices. In terms of gig economy, I've seen some interesting movements pushing back on that. There's something called platform cooperativism, and I don't know if you've done a program on it, Alexander, but it's really interesting. And they're just kind of questioning the ownership models for TaskRabbit and the like. And that has led to things like Co-opify or these app co-ops that are run by domestic workers.
Do you find that the laborers and what we believe to be the American engine, do you find that they have investments that their companies have or their small businesses have enabled them to succeed financially on a level outside of their day-to-day income? Because the gig economy notoriously does not offer the same benefits as long-standing jobs. And I'm wondering, when you do your reporting and encounter people who are facing this hardship, is there some salvation in some kind of long-term protection, whether it's insurance or benefits or stock options, because the perception is that in a conservative regime, in a conservative outlook, there is faith that these workers are going to make it one day.
Yeah, they're not going to. I mean, they're struggling. They're not going to make it, at least the way things are right now.
So do you find that they have investments?
I haven't really been following that, and we haven't looked at that personally. But yeah,
it would be interesting to see, because there is the playing field in which someone is employed, and then there is this idea of investment and potentially lucrative investment, sometimes through benefits, but sometimes independent of their profession. You point out in the project that a lot of Trump supporters are very wealthy, wealthier than the average American.
yes.
And the response to the Democratic platform was this past cycle unconvinced. Most Americans were unconvinced that there was an authentic populist message that would champion reforms for workers. Do you see the blueprint for some populist-led revolt against the system, that these workers are going to actually run for office and kind of take charge of these issues themselves?
I would so love for there to be alternative candidates to the ones we have now, especially people who are familiar with what it is like to have economic struggle. And I think that's one of the problems that makes, Democrats a little alienating to a lot of the kinds of people we write about, because they're just not, they have not known, as James Baldwin wrote, anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. And I think it's really important for us to be developing, political candidates who have actually known that experience. Part of actually what we're doing with EHRP is we're trying to actually develop writers who know that experience, which is in itself a novelty, because most of the people who write journalism about inequality are wealthy. And so what does that look like then? What are they missing?
What are they missing?
I think they're missing certain kinds of empathy. They're missing details about what it's like to live lives of struggle, not just poverty, but struggle. I think also if you're just a middle class person writing about lower income people, you have to immerse yourself. And the media economy right now is not supporting people spending weeks or years with sources. And I think for great journalism about inequality, you really need that. You need to be able to at least spend a couple days plus with an individual to walk in their shoes, as it were.
It seems like the focus should be more holistic than the minimum wage. The folks who are most concerned about economic inequality have at least politically banded together on that single issue. But that can be insulting to some workers who do come from a more conservative persuasion. Is there too much emphasis on minimum wage? Too little? How do you see the politics of that issue evolving?
I've actually really liked to see the Fight for 15, partially because of the issue, but also partially to see the effect of a grassroots campaign. To me, that itself was inspiring and comforting almost, that we could start out with a concept or a slogan and it could really take off like that. So for me, it was a very positive thing, the Fight for 15. I think one of the things that we need more of actually are slogans for inequality, around inequality. And of course we have, all the slogans that came out of Occupy, the 1%, the 99%. But I think Fight for 15 is something that a lot of people can kind of wrap their arms around and understand, oh yeah, this is what it takes to have an ordinary family in many cities and towns in America.
From what you've studied and reported on, what would be most effective as those mantras,
slogans, those mantras?
Or beneath them is policy. So
Right.
What do you see as, there's no magic bullet, but reconstituting the politics of economic inequality in a way that the Occupy movement was unable to harness, and Bernie Sanders, as a presidential candidate, was not able to make his appeal more expansive. And really in the South, he had a great opportunity to reach lower income minority voters, and he didn't.
Right. So
I'm just wondering, what you think viscerally sticks in the politics of.
well, I saw those Times slogans. You must have seen that people are trying to come up with new slogans for the Democrats.
Right.
And I definitely think it should not be I'm with her. It should be very inclusive. I think that's one thing that's missing, and also I don't know
Because the expansion of minimum wage is viewed as something of an artifice or kind of an artificial issue. If you really engage public works, opportunities from the government and private sector, and you hear a lot about public-private partnerships, but that doesn't yield the level of income or salary that allows people to have what used to be middle-class lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where does the public-private partnership fit into this? Because I think that
well, there's something
misleads
that
people.
there's a concept I've been sort of
Yeah.
pushing, which is critical human infrastructure. So instead of talking about infrastructure all the time, we should be talking about humans' jobs. And I mean, that's just in line with things like automation. Like, let's just start seeing our human workers as our rivers and our nuclear power plants and our fiber optic cables. They're just as important. So that's one slogan that I've come up with personally, but I'm sure there's probably we should probably get some ad people out there coming up with some more.
You're working on a book due to be released in 2018,
Yeah.
Squeezed. When you reflect on the project in 2017, what do you hope it will have accomplished through your relationships at the local level and the reception that it's received in these communities? What do you hope is the ultimate takeaway?
Well, the ultimate takeaway would be to seed more writers, develop lots of relationships with local papers in places like Native American papers as well, and with struggling African American local newspapers, not just straight up local newspapers, and really try to create a network of people who want to be covering inequality deeply in their community, and support these journalists who otherwise are basically unable to be journalists in other parts of the country besides DC and LA. I mean, we're very lucky right now. We're in New York City. There's a lot of media work comparatively. So it would be to kind of give more spaces and more chances also for a whole generation of journalists. So I would like to see that happen, and in places that you wouldn't expect.
Alissa, what is the mechanism people can support these local writers through?
Oh, well, you can donate to Economic Hardship Reporting Project. You can go on our site. You can read our work. You can tweet it and post it. You can also just start thinking about people who might have stories to tell. They might want to contribute, write for us, or they might just have local stories that are really about inequity in a community that we don't know about, and you can communicate that to us through our email.
And what component of citizen journalism can you integrate into the project if you are going to solicit some feedback, as you just suggested?
Oh, yes.
What is your hope that people who might not be able to support you but believe that there are underrepresented voices in the media, and rather than calling one voice fake, how can they themselves contribute as either sources or independently reporting on economic hardship themselves?
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways is for to come to places like EHRP, but also for other nonprofits to get engaged in this process. And I think it's starting to happen. There are other publications and nonprofits that are reaching out to these voices, but I think we should be all really trying to hear what they need to say.
Tell me what the most riveting story is.
Oh, yes.
That you've reported or one of your colleagues reported. What is the most riveting economic hardship?
Well, so one of the most riveting stories that I reported was about the hyper-educated poor, which was a group of adjuncts and former lawyers who are unable to support themselves. And it was more than riveting, it was incredibly moving. These are people with PhDs and masters who taught who should have been given the American dream, but instead they were making $36,000. They were driving from place to place. They were on food stamps. So I would go shopping with them at the supermarket and watch as they would try to find the oldest pack of meat for their kid who happened to be disabled as well. And to me personally, because my parents were college professors, initially community college professors, I felt like that could so have easily been me or them. And for me, that was incredibly moving and powerful. And I call those people the hyper-educated poor.
And a lot of folks would not concede or admit that dirt poor can be across the ladder of educational experience.
Absolutely. And the most riveting story that our project has supported was by a writer who was low income, who had to sell his own plasma to survive. And it was a kind of harrowing story of him going to the plasma center and being, rolling up his sleeve and almost
You don't mean
out.
plasma TV, just
I don't mean
for
plasma
viewers.
TV. I mean plasma,
Right.
from your blood. And that was somebody who had, again, been a professional journalist. And I can't emphasize enough how many of our writers are professional journalists who are really on the edge.
Alissa, stay strong.
Oh, thanks so much, Alexander.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick, Joan Gans CUNY, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and to the corporate community Mutual of America.